At UFC 252, a legend of the sport made what could well be his final walk to the octagon. And for those of us who have followed the ups and downs in the career of Daniel Cormier, it really didn't matter so much how the fight played out. Okay, don't misunderstand me. Sure, if he had reclaimed the heavyweight title in a winning effort against the champion, then yes, we would be having a very different discussion about the man's legacy right now. But anyone who understands the story of Daniel Cormier, the path that this man has walked, has already seen enough to accept his greatness without question. And I know what the narrative will be, and I get it. Cormier didn't have it easy. He didn't always find a way to ascend to a level beyond his fiercest rivals. Sometimes he lost, and in those times he lost badly. But this man has commanded a place at the table of champions in whatever it is that he has done in life. A place that he continued to hold as soon as he got it without ever faltering. If he does in fact retire as he said he will do so on the back of a career spent sitting comfortably among the greatest fighters of his generation. But how highly do we rate a fighter like Daniel Cormier? Not in terms of his own personal greatness, but if we're looking to find his place within the rarefied air of that GOAT conversation, where exactly should he fall? Well, DC has had a uniquely interesting run in the sport, one that deserves to be appreciated and understood as a whole before making any concrete claims about his legacy. After a glittering career as both a high school and collegiate wrestler, he was drafted into Team USA for the 2004 Olympics, but missed out on medaling by the narrowest of margins, falling just shy of the podium in 4th place. Next time around at the 2008 Olympics, his dedication and skill as a natural leader saw him selected as the captain of the American team, and something that foreshadowed his later role as team captain of AKA. Unfortunately, in a moment that should have been his brightest, kidney failure struck, forcing him to withdraw from the Olympics during his preparations. Excessive weight cutting has been cited as the reason behind it, and while he likely didn't know it at the time, it would be this moment that more or less stood as the end of his focus on freestyle wrestling. And this wasn't a decision made by Cormier as a young and hungry competitor fresh out of college. It was a fully grown 29-year-old Daniel Cormier who chose to leave wrestling behind him. No doubt frustrated to no end by the unfortunate circumstances that deprived him of what he surely saw as the biggest moment of his career. Of course, at that point in time, MMA had become an increasingly viable option for combat sports athletes who found themselves at a crossroads in their pursuit of athletic greatness, but this was no ordinary athlete. Cormier didn't enter the sport of mixed martial arts as a desperate attempt to make up for the glory that eluded him in wrestling. He did it as a means of mirroring and from there improving on his past failures. Debuting as a mixed martial artist at the grand old age of 30 years old, Cormier set his sights high as soon as he set foot in a cage for the first time. Barging his way through his first 7 opponents with 6 finishes, Cormier, about a year and a half into his MMA career, found himself in a reserve match for the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. And for those of you who might not be fully aware, the 2011 Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix featured a ridiculous lineup of legends who were still decently close to their respective primes. Some more than others, of course. Alistair Overeem, Andrei Arlovsky, Fabrizio Verdum, Fedor Emelianenko, Josh Barnett, Antonio Bigfoot Silva, all divisional veterans with huge experience that far outweighed the relatively green former Olympian. Cormier had attracted some hype, don't get me wrong. How could a man as decorated as he was not? But even still, when this short, stocky and completely unassuming looking heavyweight managed to enter the tournament and win the entire thing outright in dominant fashion, it became very clear that DC had massive potential. Knocking out Bigfoot Silva in the opening round saw Cormier showcasing the speed and unpredictability that would come to define his later years. At the time, it is important to note that Bigfoot was fresh off of a TKO victory over Fedor Emelianenko in the Grand Prix's opening round, and Cormier sliced him up like it was nothing. It was the first real indication of how high Daniel Cormier's ceiling was and a test that he passed with flying colours. At that point in time, 32 years old and barely 2 years into his pro career, DC had well and truly arrived, and from there onwards, aside from 1 or 2 outliers, he did nothing but compete within that elite category for the next decade. We all know what happens next. An unbeaten 13-fight stint at heavyweight gave way to a drop down to 205. 2 finishes upon reaching light heavyweight left DC face to face with the first of the 2 men who would in many ways define his mixed martial arts career. With UFC 182 came the first pairing of DC and the champion John Jones, and with that, the birth of one of the most interesting dynamics to ever exist between a pair of rivals in sporting history. At the time, it was easy for the world to pin DC into the role of the villain to Jones's hero. Beside the tall, young, attractive figure of Jon Jones, he stood at a chubby 5'11", an older, more adult figure, making the kind of remarks you'd scold your father for. Where Jones was an instant sell, Cormier was a slow burn, and it would take years for the MMA world to collectively come around to Daniel Cormier. Everyone was on Jones's side at first, and at the time it was completely understandable. You wanted to see him achieve his destiny and become the greatest to ever do it. Who doesn't want to see that? Who doesn't want a hero to look up to? For all intents and purposes, Cormier was standing in the way of MMA's Michael Jordan, the greatest rival to the man whose ceiling had not been yet established. And we all wanted to see that story told to its fullest. So when Jones dispatched of Cormier in a strong showing over 5 rounds at UFC 182, the story continued, and for DC, that loss stood as the first wall that he would encounter in his career as a mixed martial artist. Call it what you want, but Cormier's pursuit of greatness was given a lifeline in the shape of the infamous hit-and-run incident involving the champion, one that forced Jon Jones into a temporary hiatus from the sport, leaving the light heavyweight crown up for grabs. Over the next 4 fights, Cormier won and defended the light heavyweight strap against a pair of the finest contenders of the era, Anthony Johnson and Alexander Gustafsson. We need not speak about his short-notice matchup with Anderson Silva. It was a last-minute matchup of very little consequence, all things considered. But in this time, for my money, Cormier was the champion. Following his first defeat to Jon Jones, the final 10 fights of his career were either for a belt or fought by DC with the belt in his possession. You can say what you want about the legitimacy of his reign as champion at 205 pounds, but that was over 2 years of time where Jon Jones was not in the picture. In my eyes, Cormier did what he had to do. He improved where he had to improve and beat the challengers to his throne with that air of a champion surrounding him. But then, of course, Jon Jones returned. And all of a sudden, the most fascinating rivalry in combat sports had a second helping. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Cormier did well, and in many ways he did a lot better than the first fight. But Jon Jones exploited his weaknesses, worked the body consistently, kept him guessing, and despite it being a close and competitive fight, finished it in emphatic fashion in the 3rd round. It was honestly a fantastic bout between 2 masters of their respective crafts, but, again, Jones put some serious distance between himself and his greatest rival. Look, you don't have to be the greatest to be great, but even still, Cormier was in something of a weird spot once again. Now shut out of a trilogy with the man who served to fuel his competitive fires, DC's lowest moment was also televised, given the baffling decision to interview him on live television after being brutally KO'd like that. And yet, Cormier persevered, and once again, Jones found a way to shoot himself in the foot, testing positive for a banned substance, leading to DC's reinstatement as champ. In that position, what else could Cormier do but carry on? And carry on he did, taking on the dangerous contender Volkan Ozdemir at UFC 220 as the co-main event to a clash between the heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic and his challenger, the monstrously powerful Francis Ngannou. For Cormier, his options at this point were limited. Where his nature would no doubt push him to pursue Jon Jones once more, from what I gathered from the way he spoke about the matter, that rivalry and all of the negativity that it spawned was something that he wanted to move on from. He didn't do so with the type of closure that he would have liked, of course, but he moved on nonetheless. And of course we all know what happened next. Returning to the division he started in, Cormier once again found great success, as he knocked out the consensus UFC heavyweight GOAT, dominated Derek Lewis, and enjoyed a pair of hugely competitive rematches with Stipe, albeit in losing efforts. Those fights are pretty fresh in our memories, not much more needs to be said. But on the subject of Cormier's legacy, that decision, that move to leave 205 pounds in the hopes of redefining himself within this sport, that, for me, solidified Daniel Cormier as one of the greatest of all time. Sure, he came in as number 2 to both Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic, as second placed to the 2 greatest fighters in either division's history, but how many fighters can say that they've done that? It wasn't just a case of him challenging for titles in separate divisions on one occasion each before slipping into a decline. No, Daniel Cormier is the biggest win on either man's resume. He fought 5 times against these undisputed greats, and it didn't always go his way, but he remains the most integral component in the legacies of both Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic. And he defeated every single other fighter he fought, across 2 different weight divisions. Cormier gets a lot of stick from fans who can't see beyond a fighter's shortcomings. You give him 10 attempts to beat Jon Jones, does he manage to get it done once? I don't know. But I'm not going to sit here and measure Daniel Cormier's greatness based on his ability to be the single greatest. In my book, Cormier is a top 10 fighter of all time, and I believe that history will smile on this man's achievements, his highs, his lows, and the performances that he drew out of his rivals. Daniel Cormier is a champion through and through, and while he didn't medal at the Olympics, and he couldn't quite get the better of his two greatest opponents, he deserves a level of respect that is reserved for only the finest competitors, champions, and ambassadors for this sport. MMA will miss Daniel Cormier. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. And as always, thank you for watching.